Hello and welcome to Straight On Till Disney, a Disney deep dive analysis podcast, where each week I, your host, Jonathan, will dissect and analyze each Disney film, starting with the production history right down to the film and what the film means to me. Each film we will dissect, analyze what makes the film great, what makes the film not so great, and how and why the source material impacted the film, and how that then allowed for a unique and dissective analysis to create the product that we love in today. After dissecting the film, we will then deep dive into the legacy that the film has left behind and what that then means for the parks and how that legacy has left on through the parks, and that really allows for a unique and dissective ideology into what makes Disney so unique and universally loved by a wide range of demographics. So, who am I? My name is Jonathan, and I am your host. I am a Disney fanatic, as many of you probably are listening. And what that means is that I've grown up with Disney for a very long time. And that means I grew up in a very unique era of the Pixar films mainly being what I associated with Disney, and then growing up with the revival era. That's then allowed for me to have a unique and interesting perspective into creating unique and versatile stories, and that really allows me to dive deeper into the older films and find out what made them so great in the time. And I think one of the main things that a lot of people have forgotten and don't really seem to take into fact, especially in the 21st century, is the context in which these films were crafted were, and that they are a product of their time. And that very much interests me deeply in creating unique and diverse storytelling possibilities by allowing for these new and interactive stories to be told to a vast array of Disney fans from many, many ages. So I grew up mostly with Toy Story, Cars, The Incredibles, Monsters Inc., and that really allowed me myself to grow up and have a love for these characters. And then I was also grew up in the revival era of Disney. So Tangled, Frozen, Zootopia, that era of Disney where Disney was back on a high. And that's really interesting to look at as how the different eras have flipped and flopped, as one might put it, in creating storytellers and how they've really, to speak the pun, to ride that roller coaster of a unique and telling company. And I do find that that's really interesting to look at from a dissective analysis, which is what I aim for this podcast to be, in looking at, we start with the production history, how the film was crafted, the idea behind it, the source material that the film was based upon, and how that then impacted what we are watching, to then dissecting the film at home and what really makes it the film that people still love to this day. And then we'll look at how that's then impacted the parks, how then the parks have impacted the films vice versa, especially for much younger audiences whose first real, to be honest, encounter of characters like Snow White, Pinocchio, Fantasia is through the parks because they never grew up with it. And I think that's really interesting and unique thing to think about as well on top of that. And I think for me personally, I grew up watching Once Upon a Time. So that very much gave me an understanding of who Snow White was, who Cinderella was, these these older characters that were getting reinvented in this modern way of storytelling. But that allowed me to then go back and watch these films and find out what the original story was here, how Disney created them. And I think that's a really unique and interesting look upon as well. And I quite enjoy that. To think what was it that came before? What was it that audience now like? And I think that's incredibly interesting to think about in terms of crafting films and in terms of crafting stories. Because for me personally, Disney's always been a bit of an escapism. And I think even much more now, Disney's very much needed. And you just get this giddy, nostalgic feeling when you hear the first few beats of the opening to a Disney film because it's so nostalgic and so interesting and so unique. So, some of my favourite Disney films. So, although I grew up loving and living through the revival era and the early Pixar days of the classics, because I do think some of the Pixar films, they're not as what they were, but everyone goes through ups and downs in creating films, and I do think audiences need to be a bit more mindful of that. So some of my favourite Disney films include The Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast, Hercules, Hunchback of Notre Dame. So that 90s Disney era that I think we don't really talk about a lot. Well, we talk about Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast, and Hercules a lot, but Hunchback I do think is slept on a bit with unique stories, and I think the reason why I gravitate towards these stories is because of how unique and how these characters each have their own, and they will have their own goals in terms of wanting to live on land. Well, see what's on land, wanting to go explore the world, wanting to be who they want to be, and not being defined by these traits. And I do think, for example, Beauty and the Beast is a great example of it's an enemies to lovers story, but at the end of the day, it's her not, she's not immediately in love with him. She gradually grows to care for him, and that is a much more nuanced and unique storytelling point of view compared to something that we might see in the earlier films. And that's not to say that that's a bad thing, but it's an interesting evolution to to comprehend and think about. And I do think I adore these films because I think they have the best scores, the best themes, and I do think these are some of the better of the 90s. That's not to say that the other ones aren't. I just think they're some of the more bigger hits. And that's not to say because some people might like Aladdin, The Lion King. I just don't gravitate towards them as much as I do these, and I think it's because I have much more of an attachment to those four. Mm, maybe Mulan. I haven't watched Mulan in a while, so Mulan could fall under that. In terms of Pixar, my favorite films, I've always been a Cars fan. I will always be a Cars fan, and I do hope one day to get to go to Cars Land in California. One day. And I've always been fascinated by it. I think it's an incredibly well done story, the first film. Second film, if you forget about it, it's a blast to watch. I mean, I really love The Incredibles, and I love the Toy Story franchise. And I know some people are like, we don't need a fourth or a fifth, but I do think 4 and 5, when 5 just come out, they're equally unique stories for younger audiences. And I think they resonate with when they were created. And I will discuss that when we get to Toy Story. Why I think people need to just take a minute and think this is a unique story for another generation to fall in love with these characters. And another one, I really love Finding Nemo. I think all the early Pixar films, so Toy Story, Monsters Inc., Finding Nemo, Incredibles, Cars, Ratatouille, Wall-E, I do think that they are incredibly crafted and beautifully done. And I think up till that era of Pixar is when it was at its peak. I do think they've had some hits, with Inside Out and Coco, but I do think it's been up and down a bit. And that's not to say it's a bad thing, because that's what all films that have been going on, well, companies like this have always been going on with. And I do quite find that interesting to look at from a demographic and what the needs and wants of an audience are seeking from this film compared to what they were seeking originally. And I think that's a really interesting, unique thing. So one of the things is I do want to say is I've studied film and media for the last 5 years with college and uni. So I have a very big understanding of how media is crafted, the theories behind why that's crafted. So some of that will feed into this podcast as well as having the fun with Disney. There is that critical analysis side that will come from that background that I have in studying it. When it comes to favourite characters, I have quite a few. And as I've just mentioned with that, is some of my favourite characters are the villains. And I think it's because they have a much more complexer. And I think it comes down to the thing of, because I grew up with Once Upon a Time and seeing how these characters became that, the backstory behind it, I think I find it more fascinating in how someone became like that. And some of my favourite villains include Cruella de Vil, whose live action film is one of the best. I do think, we'll say that. Some of the other ones include Ursula, Hades, Frollo. I think there's some of the really unique ones, and I'd throw Dr. Facilier and Mother Gothel in there too, with them coming from that 90s era where they're much more crafted as musical Disney films in comparison. Yes, the older Disney films had songs, but they weren't built and crafted in the way that Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast, Hercules, that they didn't have the I Want song, those songs that allow you to understand what you're watching. And what I think, and I do think that without these 90s villains, I don't think we'd have the Disney villain portfolio today, in that, along with the Disney Princess line, you'll have the Disney villains line. Yes, you had the Evil Queen, Maleficent, Lady Tremaine, Captain Hook, Cruella to an extent, but I do think she falls under the more later ones in what made the Disney villains brand so iconic that now we're getting a Disney villains land, which I'm very excited for. Because I just think we gravitate towards these characters because it's a little bit more interesting. There's a little bit more meat on the bone, so to speak, with how and why. And I think that's a really interesting thing to think about and discuss. Other characters that I really adore are The Little Mermaid. I really love Ariel. I've always been a big Little Mermaid fan, and I do think that those characters. So yeah, I do think that without those characters, we wouldn't have what we have today in terms of the iconicness having the Disney villain songs, because Poor Unfortunate Souls and Mother Knows Best, those songs really are iconic because of the way they're performed. And I'll touch upon it in a bit when I talk about my favourite Disney songs, is I do think that there is this level of iconicness from these characters because they are very much crafted in this way, and it's really interesting, and they delve into what their goals are through these songs, and I do think it's an interesting thing to think about. I've always been a Little Mermaid fan, so Ariel, Ursula, Eric, those characters are very dear to my heart, and I think it's because I really relate to certain parts of the Little Mermaid story in terms of crafting that story and allowing it to create. Prince Philip will always be one of my favourite Disney characters for many reasons. And I do think when it comes down to it, another one is of my favourites is Belle. And I think between Ariel and Belle, I think they are my favourite Disney princesses, excluding Elsa and Anna because I don't class them under the princess banner because Frozen was such a mega hit. And I do think it's a really interesting and unique thing to think about in terms of characterization. In that, I do think without Ariel and Belle, we wouldn't have this much more of a bigger push for female led stories that we do today in terms of Disney in allowing these characters to really flesh themselves out. And yes, there's still hints towards connotations of the past, but these contextual factors are very much reflected within society. And I think one of the clever things Beauty and the Beast does is having its villain be a personification and characterization of all the male stereotypes that Belle should be wanting to love, but she doesn't. And I think that's incredibly well done on Disney's part, and there's no reason why Beauty and the Beast was up for a Best Oscar animation nod. You can fact check me on if it did win, because I'm not 100% sure if it ever did, but 90s, you can always guarantee I know when every Disney film was released. But when it comes to some of the other factors, to be fair, when we get to Beauty and the Beast, I might actually find out that answer myself, so maybe I'll just leave that there. Some of my favourite Pixar characters include Rex, because I've always felt that I fit in, and I've always felt very much personally connected to that nervy, stressy anxiety that Rex has, and that's always been a thing. But one of the things I think is interesting to look at when it comes to Pixar is Pixar's able to create that dynamic duo more so than I do think Disney does, and I'm glad that Disney didn't start doing this themselves and allowed Pixar to have this thing. Very much in the early Pixar films, in terms of you'd have Woody and Buzz, Mike and Sully, Lightning and Mater, Linguini and Remy, Up and Carl, so Wally and Eve. So those early films from the early noughties really established these big, great friendships that fold into the story and very much are what is at the heart of each of those stories. And I think that's a really interesting and nuanced thing. And I probably will go into much further detail when I get to Pixar films later on down the line. Is how uniquely they are crafted and how that this kind of USP in a way of having center core be two main characters that are very much opposites, being able to found family within each other. I do think that that is a really unique and interesting thing that they managed to do in being part of the Disney brand, but having this kind of different edge and telling different and new stories in a way that I don't think Disney had found a way to do quite yet, and they were trying to in the early noughties, but just didn't manage it till they went back to doing adaptations of the original source materials with Princess and the Frog. And I do think Princess and the Frog is also a bit slept on because of it being the first of the Disney revival era, because you don't really hear people talk about it as much with the Tangled, Wreck-It Ralph, Frozen bracket, because it does feel like it would be in the Renaissance era, but actually it is more in the revival era and was released then. So what are some of my favourite Disney songs? I have quite a few that I do love. Reflection from Mulan is one of my favourite Disney songs ever. And I do think that Christina Aguilera's re-recording for the live action film is superior in terms of vocal. I just adore listening to it again and again and again. And I do think that nobody really seems to talk about it as much that I've seen. And I do think that it's far more incredible in terms of how she performs it for the live action. Hellfire is also another song that I do think is slept on because of it being from Hunchback in Notre Dame. And it's only really now it's getting its flowers from covers and people really seeing how good that song is in terms of characterization and vocals. And I adore it. And I think it's one of the, if not one of the best Disney villain songs there is from the library. Mm. Other songs that I do love the I Want songs. So some of those include Part of Your World, When Will My Life Begin, Princess, Almost There from Princess and the Frog. What other ones are there? There's Go the Distance from Hercules, I do love. I do adore, trying to think. There's not many I Want songs from that era. First Time in Forever from Frozen. That is a really good Anna I Want song. And then you can't really talk about iconic Disney songs without talking about Let It Go. Yes, I did just sing that a little bit. And I think that is very much Elsa's I Want song. And I think the cultural impact of that song really resonated with a lot of people. And I'll discuss it when I get to Frozen in a very long time of how and why that was really a cultural phenomenon in 2013 and why it still is almost a decade on now. Well, it's a decade and 2 years on from recording this episode. And I do think it's a really interesting thing. But when the inevitable live action Frozen happens, because we all know it's going to at some point, with them doing Moana and Tangled coming soon, I do hope that some of the songs from the musical are added. So Dangerous to Dream, Dangerous to Dream, and I Want, What Do You Know About Love, and Monster are the ones that they add in because they really add more depth. The soundtrack for Hercules is also one of the best tracks with Zebra the Hero, A Star is Born, and I Want to See I'm in Love. And I really hope that these songs are in the live action when it happens because they're some of the best songs that they are in the film. And I do think that some of these songs are really interesting to think about. So, Disney parks. So, when it comes to Disney parks, I haven't been back to the park since 2014. So we're talking on 11 years now, and I know that a lot has changed within the parks, and I've kept up with a lot of what's going on because I do love the Disney parks. When I last went, we never did Animal Kingdom, so I'm not 100% sure why we didn't do it, but I know that it's had a lot of love recently in the last few years, as has Epcot. And I've done Epcot, but only half-heartedly because we could never find our way around to the countries, and I'm not sure why that was the case. So really, I've only really done Magic Kingdom and Hollywood Studios in full. And I love both of these parks, but if I was to pick a favorite, it's probably Hollywood Studios, and I think that's down to the variety that you have in that park. And that's not to say that Magic Kingdom doesn't have the variety. I just think there's something for everyone in Hollywood Studios. But I am sad that the Great Movie Ride's gone now, and I'm glad that Mickey and Minnie have a ride. But I don't really think it should have been in Hollywood Studios, if I'm in all honesty. But we people move when it comes to that, in terms of that decision, and I do think it allows for a much more unique experience because you've got something for everyone. And that's not to say that Magic Kingdom doesn't, especially now with the addition of Tron and things. But I do think there's a lot of similar rides in Magic Kingdom. maybe that is because I haven't been back for a while. I'm just going off what I can remember and what I've seen recently. And when I was last year, when I was last there, they were just redoing Fantasyland, so I never really got to experience Seven Dwarfs Mine Train and all that. So it is interesting to see, and hopefully one day I'll be able to get back out there. Be interesting to see how different it is to when I was last out there. And let's talk about some of my favorite attractions. I think, and this is something going on, is last time I was in Disney, I was 10. So I don't think I really appreciated it as much as I should have really done at the time. And I think now with a different outlook on life that I would at least do every ride once, even the ones I think I was much more terrified for, including Tower of Terror was one of those ones where I was a bit like the anxiety and thought of it back then, especially at that age of seeing that ride and knowing you drop that many times. I do think there's an inkling part of me going, I wish I'd done that better. I wish I'd thought of doing it something else in that terms of way. But if I ever did go back, or even to Paris at some point, that would be fun to do. And I do think it's interesting to see how that then transpires into creating such a unique and experience. But I think some of the other favourite rides include Midway Mania and was it Space Rangers Spin? I did enjoy Big Thunder Mountain. I have done Big Thunder. Never did Splash Mountain. I'm not sure why we didn't do Splash Mountain. I adored Seas Nemo and Friends, Living with the Land, Spaceship Earth. There's some really nice rides in Disney, but I do think if I ever did go again, I'd at least want to try do everything at least once and then say that I have done it. And I think that's where I'm going to leave and wrap up today's podcast. And I just want to say thank you for listening if you have. And I'd also like to say thank you. And hopefully you'll join me along for the ride in discussing Disney films for the next how long it takes and how long I find this thing interesting, because I'm really interested to do the research into and find out about what each of these films and the production histories. I think that's going to be a bit fascinating to watch and learn about, and I really hope that you enjoyed the podcast. So, before I go, you can follow me on Instagram at straight on till Disney Pod. I'll say that again. You can follow me on Instagram and you can follow me on Instagram you can follow me on Instagram at straight on till Disney Pod. There we go properly. I'll get that. It will also be linked in the bio, but I'll also have that said properly the next time, as this is only the first time I'm doing this. So thank you for listening and bye.